I thank you so much. I welcome you, Tyler. Tyler,
Okay, thank you, Rita.
thank you.
And thank you to everybody who shared some of those quotes. Thank you to Dupre and Barry for that beautiful song. That's one of my favorite songs, and I don't think I've ever heard it better. Can't say where I first heard it. I feel like it was sometime at Sunday school, though. But yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to share my presentation, and I'm going to get started. Basically, just so you all know, my scope is quite wide, if you couldn't tell from those quotes originally. Now let's just see, can everybody see my presentation?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay,
In part, I can.
in part?
It's okay. Go ahead, Tyler, please.
All right, thank you.
There are monitor differences between people.
I see, that's all right. Thank you. Okay, so hi everybody, my name is Tyler Lurie-Spicer. Thank you also to my two mothers for being on here on this call, Rebecca Lurie and Ellie Spicer. I wanted to present this talk with you all because it's Halloween next week, and it's the season, it's October. So I opened with a little video from Over the Garden Wall. I don't know if anybody knows that cartoon. It's only about 7 years old, but it's a great one, family friendly for this time of year. I thought it would set the mood right. And we'll go into some of the symbolism of that cartoon as well later on. But I will say that when Felix Adler referred to Beatrice in the quote that that Liesl kindly read, Beatrice is one of those characters in that cartoon. So let's go on to the next one. There's about now, everybody can see the next slide? Okay, so I wanted to give a land acknowledgement and general acknowledgements. It was perfect that Vondra showed the map of the different territories. I believe it showed the 3 territories that we have here. So I'm currently on Haudenosaunee territory, and specifically near the Cayuga Nation. And then I know that you all are on Lenape territory. So typically when we acknowledge territories in Haudenosaunee territory, we use the Hiawatha Belt. I did a little bit of research on these other territories, and I found that this is the Lenape Belt, but this was between them and the Pennsylvania state. So this was sort of their agreement or their treaty back in the day. Who knows how much has been honored now, but the other belt is from the Wabanaki, which I also saw were on that map that Vondra showed. And we'll get into the Wabanaki, but since we're talking about Salem, that is going to be on Penobscot Wabanaki territory. So, and that is the Puritan time period. So there's actually quite a lot of interchange with the indigenous people at the time period we're going to discuss. Then on the other 2 sides, I have the women. I have some work from Maria Gambutas. She is an archaeologist from the 90s and the early 2000s, and she found a lot of patterns and symbolism throughout traditional spiritualities that worship the goddess. And so these were 2, one from Hungary and the other one from Romania, about 1,000 years apart. But you can see that the symbolism of the goddess never changes. And if you were to ask a child to draw a woman 1,000 years from now, it may look very similar to that. So I wanted to also acknowledge all of you, the Ethical Culture Society. I wanted to thank you all for hosting me. Thank you all for my upbringing and bringing me to this platform today. Now, in addition to sort of acknowledging the violence that has been done against the indigenous people represented here, I also wanted to acknowledge the violence that has been done against women to lead to the patriarchal world we have today. But on the flip side of both of those, I also wanted to honor the Native people for the wisdom they've given us because, for example, in Haudenosaunee territory, the matrilineal society structure was sort of co-opted by America in many ways, and it is a lot of roots for the civil rights movement and the suffrage movement for women, specifically in Seneca Falls, that fell on Haudenosaunee territory. I'd also like to honor the women for their generation of knowledge, wisdom, and life itself over time immemorial. Last but not least, I'd like to acknowledge and thank my partner, Kay Yang. She's on here and she's awesome. Kat, she and I have been together for almost 10 years now, and she's been my partner through all of this, thick and thin, and going to all of the places that I'm going to take you all today. So let's get started. All right, so I said that my scope is large, so I'm going to try and summarize all of human history if we can in 30 minutes. So bear with me while I may brush over some things. For example, we will not be talking about the Middle Ages. That's about it. Everything else we're going to talk about. But I realize that my talk is not going to be a linear trajectory. It's going to be maybe a little bit more cyclical as we go with the patterns of trying to relate things back to the themes of humanism. That's something I want to keep throughout this presentation. And so really, I wanted to start by talking about these three different time periods and separate it by the quotes that everybody read. So Maria Gimbutas, she's talking about the pre-Bronze Age, and we'll show you the timeline next. And then we have the witch trials, which is very different in Europe than it was in America. And we'll get into some of those differences, but the time period really flows from one to the other. So you'll understand that, for example, if you ever have the imagery of the witches burning, that's typically considered in Europe, whereas witches were typically hung in America. The other major difference we'll get into, but I'll sort of present it now because I think it's really important for framing, is that in America, everyone who was murdered and executed, men and women, all pled not guilty. That's why they were killed. So nobody who admitted to being a witch was killed. Everybody who admitted to being a witch was let free. Whereas in Europe, it was very different. It was a little bit more of a colonial tactic as they colonized inside of themselves. So that's why I actually include Germany here as becoming a state in 1871. Germany was a place where there was a lot of witchcraft. And they had a lot of challenges as they tried to bring that state together. And it came to a culmination, actually, while Adler was visiting over there. And he's from Germany himself. So we'll get into all of that later, but I wanted to bring that in. And also the English component, because the Puritans were from England. Vondra was sharing a great story with me about a witch who was accused in Scotland. And it's just important to understand the European and Western context, but also globally, witch hunts are still happening today around the world against women who are trying to speak up for their rights. And I think we need to acknowledge that as well, as this is an ongoing struggle. When we talk about colonization, it's an ongoing struggle. When we talk about the oppression of women, it is ongoing. None of this is history. It all informs our present day. So let's go into the cyclical outline. Basically, I wanted to talk about ancient world spirituality and the goddess. And I wanted to talk about how has it survived through Western religions? So a lot of Western religions have co-opted and taken these themes from ancient roots of spirituality. Maybe even Felix Adler took some of these themes. We saw that in his quote earlier, and I'm going to try and go into that later. We'll break down how Felix Adler may have taken some of this, reverence for the woman, or reverence for some models we have of goddess worship. But it's always within a male gaze, and this presentation is through my gaze as well. So we're going to problematize and critique Felix Adler as well as the big theologies, and we're also going to problematize science as well. So if you look later, you'll see that I talk about Cornell University and the Academy. And sort of how that was positioned as a opposition to religion. And so science and religion have always been at war with one another. We'll get into that a bit. And then we have the witch trials, and we're going to go into Salem. I'm going to take you all there. You're going to come with me to a trip I went on recently with my partner, Kat. We're going to walk through the streets. We're going to go through some exhibits. And then lastly, we've got the spiritual truths that remain for humanism. What can we take away? So I'll leave that for our conversation at the end. But really, my thesis is answering that big question that we always ask ourselves: how do we break these cycles of violence? So let's step into my answer to that, which I think many of you might agree with, but many may not. And we also can talk about it more. But we need a spiritual component in humanism that is fortified in ancestral wisdom to disentangle us from the dueling deception of theocratic and scientific authority. So my thought here is that, we're often seen as science as being the way to oppose religion. And also throughout religion, there's always been Satanism. There's always been this dark side. Since it's Halloween, I think we can talk about evil. We need to name it in order to see it. And so before science was resisting religion, there was other subversive elements resisting religion. As a Jewish person, I can say in 1666, there was the Sabbatean movement where half of all Jews, 1 million Jews and 50% would believe that sin was a virtue, was a mitzvah. And so you can see that throughout time, there's been this challenge and pushback to theocratic dogma within theocratic dogma and different schools of thought. So right here, I'm presenting a few different ideas. We have the History of the Warfare of Science, which was written by A.D. White, the founder of Cornell University. And one of his contemporaries was another man who basically created the first picture of a woman's face, and also created the first picture of the moon. Now, the first picture of the woman's face seems very real. This is allegedly the first picture we have of the moon. It's a little odd, but I thought that would come up. And these two gentlemen are seen as the founders of the conflict theory. And it's this idea that science and religion are inherently at war with one another, and scholars since have tried to break that down a little bit more. So we're going to talk about that debate. We're going to talk about it a little bit more, but I want to bring us back to our roots. This is where we get cyclical. So this is my favorite timeline when we conceptualize all of human history, and we're looking at the history of the goddess. This is very much influenced by Maria Gimbutas's work, and I will say because of that, it's actually dated. If anybody knows about Göbekli Tepe, that's considered really the origin of agricultural societies out of Turkey, and that's just being uncovered now. There's a great Netflix fictional thing called The Gift, where they go into it. If you want something fun that's a little bit more advanced than Over the Garden Wall, I would suggest checking out The Gift on Netflix. It's great. Talks about these themes. But here you can see we have the most ancient is 250,000 years ago. And you can see it's traced through Europe. And you can see also from the Pyrenees, we have cave paintings, but all of this are depictions of the goddess. And you can see they're not necessarily, and as Maria Gimbutas says, they're not erotic. They're more talking about the woman's ability to give life and take it, and her synchronicity with nature. And then on the second half, you can see how it starts to get adopted into Western cultures. So I think, when we talk about our own religion and spirituality, I'll pause here briefly. We try not to appropriate indigenous cultures, but how can we still talk about our indigenous cultures, particularly me as being a white person and with European ancestry? I actually have Lithuanian ancestry, and that's shared with Maria Gimbutas. She's Lithuanian. So she's a great scholar that I like to refer to. And I think it's great for us to think about what ancient traditions can we call on when we try to think of what is spirituality for us and how can we root it. So here we can hear Maria Gimbutas says, I'll read this one. I won't read all quotes, but this one's good. There is no doubt that the prehistoric veneration of Mother Earth survived intact up to the time of worship of Demeter and Persephone in Greece and elsewhere. Her power was too ancient and too deep to be altogether destroyed by succeeding patriarchal religions, including Christianity. She was therefore absorbed and became known in Western Europe as various saints. So I'm going to start picking up the pace a little bit here, but I'm sure you all can think of different goddesses. We have here the Parthenon, which is to worship Athena in Greece. Then we also have here the goddess Venus, which symbolizes life and fertility. And then here we have, this is supposed to be Mother Mary, but also I was recognizing that symbolically it's very similar. You have the shell of Venus, but also with the baby, we have the Black Madonna. And the Black Madonna is actually has, as far as I understand, has European roots to it. And there's a lot more to uncover here. But Maria Gimbutas talks about how she represents the earth and the blackness of the soil. There may be other interpretations of this as being, of having African roots as well. But there's a lot more to talk about it. But we can see the goddess is represented throughout the Western era. So I want to go back to the opening quote with Maria Gimbutas because I want to talk about paganism a little bit, this kaleidoscope of meaning of life, and specifically why Halloween? Why now? What are we talking about this time of year? And so Halloween is not just this ephemeral time that we come and celebrate and then we get candy and leave. It's actually part of every year, part of every yearly cycle. And typically we know that, the solstices fall on Christmas. We know the summer solstice, so those the two oppositional times. Then we know our equinoxes also symbolize certain holidays. And so traditionally humans have always worshiped the harvest in these times of year. So if you then cut those equinoxes and those solstices in half, you get 4 other holidays throughout the year that pagans have traditionally, or the earth-based religions have traditionally practiced. And what's interesting is a lot of these practices, they go around the world. They're not just rooted in one culture or one place. It's everyone who has to live on this planet follows the cycles of it. So why Halloween? This was from, now we're going to start seeing Salem footage a little bit. And this was nature's cycle of life and death is palpable as people celebrating the harvest to prepare for the winter ahead. And so you can see that Christianity has co-opted this holiday as All Saints Day, which is going to be on November 1st. But Halloween is supposed to be All Hallows Eve. It's also considered Samhain in other cultures. But I like this imagery because it sort of shows the other All Saints in this little miniature vignette that we saw when we went to Salem. So here's where I want to pull in Maria Gimbutas and talk about natural law.
There's the creek going down to the waterfall.
So I am noticing that the audio is playing, but I want to let you know that this is my dear friend who I wish could be here, and she is a water witch. She actually can go around and use these sticks to find where wells are on someone's land. And it's just this hobby that she has, but she's able to do it. And it's this magical thing that women have been able to do throughout history when people have needed to dig a well. So when you're going to have all the men go hands deep and keep digging for 20, 30, 50 feet, they have to have faith that they're digging in the right spot. And so there was always a woman, a water witch, who would practice finding where that spot was to give them that faith and reassurance. So I'll let you all read this quote, but I think it's really perfect. And it talks about really the goddess as being not just life-giving, but also death-wielding. And this is where we have the parallel with nature. And we're going to close with a song on water. I wanted to incorporate more themes of water in here. If you're talking about the goddess and women, you cannot avoid water. But you'll see that many of the locations I bring you to today are on the coast. And the goddess is often seen as the place where the water can sweep you away as much as it gives you life. All right, so let's hop into Felix Adler. And so he had this quote where I love that he uses the term moral law because it helps us find parallels with natural law. If you look through his text, anytime he uses the word woman, it's always next to man. And if he always talks about deifying a woman, he's also talking about deifying the laborer in the sentence before that. So always be mindful of that. He has these dichotomies in his Victorian upbringing. But I think that here it's really great because he's essentially, we can break this down a little bit, what resonates in this quote and what doesn't. So we have moral law versus natural law. Both are ways to articulate instinctive respect for women's power, but also at the same time, he's idealizing her. He's devoiding a woman of personhood, of agency. So when you look at the end of his quote, why is the woman not sacred? Her honor is. And we all know what is a woman's honor in the eyes of men. And he's talking about proselytizing other men to join his religion and to join his faith. And so his way of looping them in is basically talking about you want to protect your woman's honor, not that you want to protect your woman. So we can start to see how there's certain truths and then there's certain ways they're co-opted through the male gaze. Okay, here's a brief history on Felix Adler. Basically, I'll run through this very quickly. He immigrated from New York to New York City from Germany in 1856. He went to Columbia University, graduated in 1870, and then he got his doctorate degree in Germany during the time of the unification that I explained that happened in 1871. Then he came back home after with his doctorate, and he wanted to speak at his father's temple. And he was a rabbi for one sermon because he refused to use the word God. And so by refusing to use the word God, the people at his temple, which was the largest in New York City, said, "We don't want you to come back." So where was he going to go? What could he do? Where could he find a home? Cornell University is where he landed. And that's where I've been. That's where I went to school. And that's where I've been working for about 3 years now. So I'm going to share a lot of personal stories and we're going to dig through the Cornell archives a little bit. It's going to be a very Cornell centered theme, but it's lovely to hear that this was sort of Felix Adler's interlude into humanism. So you'll see that he actually was discharged or not renewed at Cornell due to his radical beliefs. I need to dig deeper into this, but I believe it may have been his hardcore atheism, but I also think that's an oversimplification. So that's for further research. But essentially, he came back. He had a lot of supporters, and he was also a non-residential professor. So I believe he was still living in New York City and traveling up to visit for lectures. So his supporters in New York City basically said, okay, you're done at Cornell. Great. We're going to start ethical culture. So it was literally 1, 2, and 3. I mean, there was no pause for this man. He was, I believe, 26, as someone said, when he founded ethical culture. And then I have a little bit of the history here. His wife was very involved in the district nursing program and also starting up this free kindergarten program that became the Fieldston School that we know of today. Oh, and then he ended his career at Columbia. I should say that. He was the director there. So this is the Cornell chimes. Why did Cornell appeal to Adler? Cornell appeals to most people because of the beautiful chimes. This is a Beethoven song. It's one of my favorites. This is the library that we're going to go into later is connected to this door right here in the tower. And this is the library that A.D. White created. And this is A.D. White on the left. He's the founder, the founding president of Cornell, the co-founder. Ezra Cornell and A.D. White founded it together. And A.D. White, I worked for 2.5 years. I was the building coordinator for his mansion, the home that he lived on campus. And that was my job. So that's when I got to get really interested in this topic. And A.D. White wrote this History of Warfare of Science with Theology that we discussed earlier in Christendom. And that was sort of his principal founding text. He wanted to basically show that the university was secular and could be a place that would be oppositional or perhaps have more nuanced conversations than the church. On the right over here, you'll see that there were atheist students, there were Christian students, and there were Jewish students. And when Felix Adler came in, he was their first professor. He was the token Jew. They wanted somebody who was going to be Jewish to speak to their students. It didn't matter that he had just gotten kicked out of his congregation. They wanted to bring him on. And it looks like actually the number of Jewish students were about similar to the number of atheist students around the time that Adler was there. Okay, let's move on because we need to talk about women in the academy. So this is Sage Hall. This is the residential dorm where women would stay. And then I also in the archive, I found a number of just different treasure troves and boxes from different women who had archived their time at Cornell. So I just wanted to show you a little bit of their collections. These women are maybe from the early 1900s. So they would be while Felix Adler and A.D. White were alive, but maybe a little bit after the time we just discussed. That's when photography became more popular. And then, this is a quote that I had from A.D. White. And I think that it's important to point out here what A.D. White is saying. And he's talking about the idea of manly methods. So he's talking about how we can use the academy of bringing women in to maybe bring them more into this concept of the manly world, right? And so it's interesting because the academy and bringing women into the academy, there were reasons why men wanted to do this. It wasn't necessarily pure benevolence. It wasn't because they just wanted to give women the right to education. They also wanted the ability to sculpt their minds. And so there's this quote that I'll read you from this book that's called Sage Hall. So when they actually renovated Sage Hall, the wife of the man who led the renovation, she wrote this great book. And in it, she said that the College for Women, Sage Residential College for Women, opened its doors in 1875, a bold move by the young university, since only a few other institutions of higher education in the US admitted women at the time. Yet the concept of coeducation was not universally embraced by the university community, and the building, while enabling education of women, also functioned to confine them to a supervised space. So here's a darker quote I found from A.D. White. Is this video playing okay for you? I see it glitching on my end. Can I get a thumbs up, or I'll pause it if not? Okay. Well, I'll let it go anyway. This is the Declaration of Sentiments. So this is the monument at Seneca Falls in New York State, not too far from Cornell University. And basically what A.D. White is saying here is he talks about from Mary Stuart, the Castle of Amboise, the last good woman who has shrieked against science, from the Camarilla, which plays the plots of reaction in every European court, down to the weakest hunter of the mildest heresies in remote villages. The fetishisms and superstitions of this world are bolstered up mainly by women. So not only is this a horrifying quote, but the context of it is even odder. He's writing to the Board of Trustees trying to convince them to allow women into the university. And so the idea here is that it is basically, we need to cleanse women of these fetishisms, of their superstitions, in order to have a more modern, contemporary scientific world. So I essentially, when we're talking about the colonization of witchcraft and things like that, and of women's spirituality, we can see that it really culminated in the university and bringing women into the university. And then we can talk about that a little bit, but it was not for their own good. It was really to stop the women from shrieking against science. So I wanted to bring up some recent debates that my contemporaries, my peers, ethical humanists are talking about. Anya Lena Overman, I want to thank her for bringing this up over Facebook just 3 or 4 days ago. And so she was asking, why did she just find out that Felix Adler was opposed to women's suffrage? It's not something that people talked about very often. And part of what she also talked about here is, how does this then create ongoing legacies of patriarchy? How do we break this down when we look at ethical culture? And so she references John Dakin's platform, and she references that this is a conversation that's really evolving, but that we need to continue having. And I think we'll talk about it later, because
Beatrice? My brother's name is
We'll go back to that in a minute. I'm going to talk about a little bit more in this dialogue. There was a lot of really great responses. Christian Hayden, that you all know, he made a great point in this thread talking about how basically A.D. White's wife was a great suffragist, and that he would basically, when he would give sermons, she and her suffragist colleagues would show up, and that he wouldn't really stop her from being a suffragist. It was one of those things they would quibble about in the household. So he had a great response to this too. And then Joan Johnson Lewis, that you all likely know, she had some great responses that I'll get to in a minute, but I'm going to drag out my contemporaries for a bit while we go back into this history. So I want to go back, since we're talking about Felix Adler, the opening quote I gave you all refers to Beatrice. And so Beatrice is actually this allegory for Dante's Inferno. So if anybody knows Dante's Inferno, it's basically the story of this protagonist as he descends into the depths of hell and comes back up on the other side, and what he learns through that journey and his process. And Beatrice is this woman or this goddess that exists in heaven and gives him some encouragement, but she never stops him from making his mistakes. She just kind of advises him. So we can see that this goddess Beatrice is represented through Over the Garden Wall in a really sort of friendly childhood way. And then I found this other much darker representation of Beatrice that I probably won't play right now, even though it's just a cartoon. I see children here, and it would give me a nightmare as a child. But you can see that the goddess is seen as both
My name's Craig. What's yours? Beatrice? My brother's name is Wirt. Who cares?
I thought we were friends, huh?
So you can see that there's this both this evil goddess, and then we have this bird, this little blue bird that basically is their guide as they go through this journey together. And essentially in this story, Over the Garden Wall, they go through purgatory. That's the goal. And so Beatrice, the little the bird, this is a better clip audio to avoid copyright. I'm going to play this one. It's somebody hand sketched. I think it's a fan fiction, but
How about I bring you to Adelaide of the pasture, the good woman of the woods? She could help you get home. Oh.
No. Magic talking birds leading us to fairy godmothers and the mysterious... I'm going to Pottsfield.
Yeah, we're going to Pottsfield. Come on. What about the favor? I'll think of my wish later.
So in preparing for this talk, I was always trying to think, how do we make Halloween more wholesome in a way, right? And more approachable, where we can still talk about the themes of this holiday as we turn from the lighter days to the darker days. And so we can see some of these ideas as really coming from Maria Gimbuta. She gave us this idea that if we're going to recognize symbols of the goddess, we need to recognize ways that the syntax of the goddess is represented over and over again through Western culture. So if we find common themes and common patterns, we can basically say, oh, these are some of these esoteric truths that come from those prehistoric eras. And so how do we basically unwrap these goddess figures that we have today from, the patriarchal view of thousands of years in order to get a better understanding? And so this Beatrice bird, she sort of lets the kids make their mistake, lets them go off, but she's always there as the bird on their shoulder to remind them of what they need to be doing. So it gives us some idea of maybe where the role of the goddess. So I wanted to go into talking about Adler's quote and Beatrice. And so if we recall, the way that he talks about it is in this very deifying way. He talks about women's honor. And so Joan Johnson Lewis, she basically in this thread with Anya's talk, she talks about putting women on a pedestal and pedestal misogyny. And then she sort of breaks it down a little bit more. I thought it was, it was a very hard-hitting first quote. And then as with everything that's hard-hitting, we always want to give it more nuance. And so I wanted to put both of her comments on here because I thought they very much related. And basically, it seems like, he married a woman who was incredibly smart. And so it sounds like she actually qualified to get into Harvard, even though she was not able to, and she was disallowed. So you can see this way where he still had immense respect for women. But there were certain ways where, his wife she had a very high standard to keep up with, very clear. So here's a picture of his wife that I found. I was so grateful to find this. And this is another quote from Joan. I'm not going to read it now, but I'll summarize it a little bit. And basically, Felix Adler thought that women should be educated. And at Cornell, he was teaching women, but he did think they should be confined to the domestic sphere. He was open and respected his wife's different opinion. It also is interesting, his wife had a few sisters, and he was very open to her sisters as well. And one of her sisters had a female lover that she lived with, which in the 1800s is not very common, but it sounds like he was accepting of her and of her lover, and he was open to them. Did he want them to vote? No, but was he open to dialogue? Yes. So these are things we can complicate and understand. And it was the New York Times who noted that when he spoke, women suffragettes would often come in great attendance because they wanted to hear what he said, and they wanted to be part of the dialogue, even if they had differing opinions. Okay, so let's go back to Cornell. We're going to talk about the admission of women, Sage Hall, and then we're going to talk about George Lincoln Burr. And this man was A.D. White's sidekick. He was the man, and he helped him build up the library I showed you, this beautiful library called the A.D. White Library, and it's in the center of campus. If you ever have a chance to go, you should visit it. A lot of people call it the Hogwarts Library. The reason why they call it the Hogwarts Library is because of the architecture, and we'll get into that in a minute. But also what's interesting is that one of the foundational sections of this library was witchcraft texts. So as A.D. White is going in and he's saying, we need to study the warfare of Christianity and science, and we need to bring women in, he's also studying witchcraft. And in this great article by Michelson that I read, he basically is trying to historicize witchcraft. And so by bringing these texts from Europe, he's basically saying, okay, now that's history. Now we can put witchcraft in the past. And so George Lincoln Burr was his right-hand man who would travel to Europe, who would go out and he would go and try and go to bookshop to bookshop. And there's a book about George Lincoln Burr called The Witch Hunter in the Bookshops. And so he would go to all of these old Christian and Jesuit universities and take any text they had. And I'll show you, actually, when I went into the libraries, I found the catalogs from those European libraries with George Lincoln Burr's notes in the side. I want this text. I don't want that text. So you'll see some footage of that later on in this presentation. The other thing to note is that he was highly influential in bringing up women who became the female elites of the academy. And so he brought up women who would be involved in other women's colleges, such as Sarah Lawrence and Vassar College and places like that. But if you look at a lot of the images, he's very pompous and high and mighty in his interactions with women. There's quite a few staged pictures where he's having staged interactions of exchanging flowers with women, and it's, it was awkward at the time. Women were not allowed in these spaces, and so he was welcoming, or maybe constructing how they were invited in those spaces. Let's see if the volume is on this. Okay, welcome to the A.D. White Library, everybody. This is the Cornell crown jewel. The White donated a collection of 30,000 books to the library, his personal collection. Can you all hear me okay? Great, thanks. At that time, the university only owned 90,000 books, and his library had collections on architecture, Reformation, abolitionism, Civil War, and of course, witchcraft. That's very loud, so I'm going to keep it a little down. But basically, you can see, these, you get the sense. It's a beautiful place. And the other thing that's interesting is the funding for this library was supposed to come from the will of this woman named Jeannie McGraw. And this is another scandal and another story, but essentially when she died, her husband took all of her money. And so there's this great tragedy of men stealing from women that could have led to making this library be a much greater and grander place. But unfortunately, she was not able to donate her wealth after she passed away. And there were other male donors, Henry Sage specifically, who funded this library. And there's a plaque for Jeannie McGraw on the side of the library when you go in. So this is some of those things I told you about. This is George Lincoln Burr. You'll see I kind of, if it'll load. Well, anyway, you can see that we have witchcraft and magic. And this is at least upright, but these are some of the catalogs that he would go through. And so when everything was locked down during the past couple years, I was grateful that the library was still open, and I was able to go down and look at some of these texts and see what were some of the things that they were looking at. And there was boxes on boxes on boxes of catalogs that represent thousands and tens of thousands of books in each box that he was going through and that he was trying to collect. Let me see if this will play. Okay, so this is when you're actually there at the Rare Manuscripts collection. A.D. White's books are no longer in that beautiful Hogwarts library. They're now kept down in the dungeon of the Rare Manuscripts collection. And this is the one showcase of A.D. White's his traditional books. So these are the books that some are on witchcraft, some are on Reformation, some are on the French Revolution. But you get a sense that they are quite historical gems. And there's a few from the 1500s. They have some court transcripts of men of the early witch trials that happened in Europe, and you can see that they were really trying to collect certain transcripts that told a certain story that backed up their more secular beliefs. But that's maybe for another time. So I've talked about the witch hunter in the bookshops. I've talked about these sort of dark ways that men were bringing women into the university in their own way. Now I want to give you some other archives I found of women really just expressing themselves. And so these were just really fun things I found. This was this woman's Halloween sort of things that she had in her scrapbook, and it was so great because it's one of the few things that's not two-dimensional in the archive, and I loved it. And then this was another one. It's 1925, so a little after our time, but you can see that there was this eclipse, a solar eclipse, right on campus, and everyone came out in throngs to see it. Let's see. So then there's also continuing this Halloween little scrapbooking that I found. This woman had just a few other things that I just thought were too cute to not include. And help maybe break up the darkness of all this. But yeah, so you can see they had all of this art that they were doing, all the fun doodles, but really a lot of it was just social events, and they were planning social events for one another, having fun with each other and just living life. So you can see this is their bigger things, and this is a Christmas party that they had. And then there's some darker elements. I don't really know what this is. I can't tell if this is a hooded figure leading a blinded hooded figure, or I don't know. There's other elements here that are mysteries to me, for sure. But these are costumes, no doubt, and there's no question about it. So you can see that all the different kinds of costumes that young college kids were up to in the 1920s. And here's where I worked. So this is the mansion. This is the A.D. White house. This is where I got to spend 2.5 years of my life, and I got to welcome people in. I got to show it to people, and I wish that you all could be there in person with me, and it would be a lot less glitchy. But it's a beautiful mansion. It was built back in 1871, and this addition on the right side was the president's house, or the president's wing, and that was built in 1911. And this porch over here is where A.D. White would give his speeches out at the end of every year.
This is the original house that was built. The screened-in porch did not used to have screens. It used to be a veranda where A.D. White's daughter was married. That balcony is where he gave his addresses to the students who were supposedly standing where I'm standing back when they had only a few. That over there is an addition, that little section. That's the president's wing. It actually belongs to the president's office now. President of
So yeah, and then I talk about President Pollock, who doesn't frequent it that much, but it's still a place where she could at any time. So then I want to go into some of the treasures that they have. So we talked about how they were going around looking for all of these witchy texts, right? Well, they also were traveling Europe looking for witchy artifacts, essentially. And so you can see throughout the A.D. White house, there is a number of furniture pieces that really revered the goddess, that really showed reverence for her. So this is one who I think looks similar almost to the Starbucks goddess, if you will. She's there's parallels to the mermaid, right? Because she has no legs. So again, we have this parallel with water. She has no legs, and it's coming up similar to the Starbucks. If you've seen the Starbucks logo, that's supposed to be a co-optation of the mermaid, the sacred mermaid. And I wish this would load a little bit better, but the goddess is flanked by devils. And so this is always interesting, is that these men who would do this wood carving, they would always, deify a goddess and then like Satanize her in a way. So you have these naked cherubs on the side, naked babies with a naked woman, and then you have these sort of demonic hooved creatures with horns. And so, when we talk about patriarchy, we can talk about the violence against women and children, but we can also talk about the control of women and children, maybe towards darker ends. And so this is sort of shows itself in this piece that we would call this the tomb. During Halloween, we would have a little hand sticking out from the middle there, and it would be this creepy thing to scare people. But my desk was right across from there. So there was a lot more furniture I could show you guys, but we have to move on. We have to get to Salem. So this is where I find Salem. And a lot of people talk about A.D. White. A lot of people talk about his collection on witchcraft. But what a lot of people don't talk about is that he's a descendant from women from a family that was accused during the witchcraft. He's also a descendant of the man who sanctified the witch trials to happen and ended them, William Phipps. So if we go in here, I don't know if you all can see, but on the first slide, I have some of his older generations. It's basically as far back as this study could go. This was handwritten notes from the 1950s that I found in the archives. Nowhere else did I see anybody mention this. So this may be the first time that the internet is, if this recording goes live, this may be the first time that the internet hears A.D. White descended from the witch women accused at the witch trials, and so this is sort of new research, but I think we have to put it in there, especially this time of year. So to get into the nitty gritty, essentially, if you go 8 generations up, he had a father, Philip White, and Philip White was a half brother to this man, William Phipps. And they both grew up in Maine together. So they shared a mother, but different fathers, so they have different last names. Now, Philip White, he had a daughter, and his daughter was accused of witchcraft. Now, she is unnamed, and I believe she passed away. So she's not a direct ancestor of A.D. White, but essentially her brother is A.D. White's direct ancestor. So if you follow A.D. White's generations, about 7 generations up, and that man's sister, that's A.D. White's connection to a woman who was accused of being a witch. Now, unfortunately, she was a child, an unnamed child, and so we don't know anything about her story. I didn't really find any mention of her throughout my journeys in Salem, but I did find a map that showed his father's home. So I'll get into that later. Where is his home now? But this gentleman, William Phipps, is a really important figure to look into because he was the governor of New England at the time. And so he was the one who basically said, he gave the church free rein to set up the court that was based on spectral evidence, and spectral evidence was considered a science at the time. But he basically gave them free rein to prosecute people who were accused of witchcraft. And it happened to be everyone who said that they were not a witch. And so we'll go in a little bit more. This one on the right is, I thought it was lovely. This one tells the story of the patrilineal. And you know, when you follow someone's ancestry, you're always looking at the father in the contemporary ancestry because it's the last name. But this is a story on the right of all of the women, all of the wives of all of the men that are represented here. So that was a good thing that I saw there. And then this is just a little bit more recent, A.D. White's sort of more recent ancestors, his father and his mother, and he grew up at this place in Homer, New York. This is where A.D. White grew up. So now you've seen both of his homes, and we drive by this home all of the time. Actually, Kat's father's friend grew up in this home, so it's a local mansion. It's, you know, we know people who have lived here, and just this summer, actually, they put up a birth marker here. So it's very cool. And something that you can see over here is that blue house behind it. I believe it's this one, or if not the one next door, was William Studdard's house. And he was the direct assistant secretary to Abraham Lincoln. So we have this little elite enclave in Homer, New York, of A.D. White being the founder of Cornell University. And he went on to be a diplomat representing the U.S. to Russia and Germany. And then across the street, you have someone who was sitting in the White House, sitting in that White House with Abraham Lincoln. So I said this would be a broad scope, but I wanted to give it all to you. Let's go to Salem. So Salem has a really interesting history. Actually, what happened was that after the witch trials, because it was so dark and it was so awful, and they really were guilty of a lot of wrongdoing, it was censored. You were not allowed to talk about the witch trials for about 200 years in Salem. There were no books written about it really until, if anyone knows Arthur Miller's The Crucible in the 1960s, I believe, was written as a fictional piece, as basically to talk against McCarthyism. And that's a whole other conversation. He did a lot of things in that text where he said that some of the women who were young girls, he made them of age, and he did a lot of things that were not very appropriate. But essentially what I'm talking about here is that Salem has a deep history in American history that goes beyond the witch trials. For 200 years, it had nothing to do with the witch trials. Now it's more of a tourist town. But before, you can see that actually it was the foundation of the United States National Guard and the foundation of the first militia that was geared up for the revolution. So you can see a lot of the elite essentially existed in this Salem town. And you can see even to this day, there's a lot of old money there. It's a harbor town right outside of Boston. So what were the witch trials? You should look it up, and then there's a lot of debates over what happened and who happened, but basically there were 2 houses. There was a new church that popped up because they wanted to go against the church that was being more modern. As you saw, it was a harbor town. So it was basically there was a lot of modern influences from ships who were trading around the world. So there was a new church that popped up, and they were trying to be more strict, and they were trying to sort of get a sense of their turf. So as with any of these things, you have these two opposing powers, and that's what led to maybe some of the targeting of different people. But in short, 19 were hung, 25 were dead overall, and 200 were accused. So this map here just kind of shows you this is only one column of many of how many women were accused. And even more astounding than the women were accused were the number of people surrounding me when I took this footage back in August. And if you were to go to Salem now, you would be pressed up against the wall. I mean, this place is swarming with tourists. And so it's just the hype of the witch trials is just never ending. They've built an economy there for sure. So let's go back to A.D. White's connection. Philip White was his ancestor. His daughter was accused. Now, here's where we get, now she's not mentioned really much anywhere. I found her mentioned in a text that was written by a Cornell scholar, actually. And I'll talk about her in another talk, I believe. But Roger Toothaker was mentioned in her text. And Roger Toothaker essentially was the one doctor who was killed for practicing counter witchcraft. And so essentially Philip White said, my daughter, she's sick, I need help. And Roger Toothaker said, well, we're going to try counter witchcraft. And it was this thing that was somewhat accepted at the time. You'll see that the people in charge were actually practicing a lot of these witchcraft, pagan or sort of alternative medicines or alternative sciences. And Roger Toothaker came in and practiced it. And I'll tell you what he did in a little bit, but he was accused for that, and he faced charges, and he was put to jail, and he never made it to trial. I believe he passed away in jail. So that's sad. Here's the map that I found of all of the old houses. I'm not sure if I can zoom in on here. I don't think I can, but Philip White's house is listed over here. And I didn't think I would find this because they technically rented at that time. So I was grateful to find the location. And it's today the home of the middle school in Beverly. So the house has been turned into the middle school. So how did it all end? Let's wrap up the witch trials by going back to Henry Phipps. Governor basically was told that his wife was being arrested and accused. So once his wife was under the gun, it wasn't enough that his niece was under the gun, right? Because that's what we just said, that his niece was being charged as a child. But once his wife was being charged, and it may have been compounding factors, he stepped in and said, this is done. You're not doing this anymore. And he was able to end it all. Now, what's really interesting, and I don't think I'll have time for this talk, but I do have slides if it comes up in the Q&A, is that during this time, he was on the frontier, and he was up in Maine building a fort in order to colonize the Wabanaki. So this is with smallpox blankets and things like that. So this is why he was not there to oversee what was going on in his hometown. He was busy colonizing natives up north. So it's interesting to see how the colonial narrative comes into play with the oppression of women. And the church and science at the time. So let's go in. I want to tell you the best way to summarize what happened in the witch trials is to actually go to a descendant of one of the women who's accused, who speaks today, Rebecca Nurse. She's one of the most prominent witches who was accused in the witch trials. She's talked about in Arthur Miller's The Crucible, and this is what she posted on Instagram. I'm hoping it's going to go through okay. So if you missed it, this is Rebecca Nurse's actual homestead. This was the place that she lived in. And there were a number of women who were accused simply for having land. This woman, Catherine, she was one of the first women who was accused. And she owned a farm, a very fruitful orchard, I believe it was. And she was accused, it was very clear, they accused her because they wanted her land. And it was at the law then, the law was that if you were accused, you did not have to be convicted and the court could take your land. So that's really what happened with the Salem witch trials. People will say ergot, people will say spirits, people will say all kinds of stuff, but really what it was there were turf wars and people wanted to take other people's land. And if there was a woman who did not have a husband to back her up, they were coming for her. So this was another woman, Catherine, and it was lovely. My partner Kat and I, we ate in a restaurant that exists where her orchard stood. This place called Taylor's, and it was a lovely meal. But yeah, so I mean, yeah, if you got a chance to read the text from this descendant of Rebecca Nurse, it says similar to what I said, but really anyone who was killed said that they were not a witch. So it was really what we were looking at here. Let me summarize what makes America witchcraft different than European witchcraft is that we have the early foundations of our carceral system that accuses people for being innocent. That's what the American witch trials is. So there's actually a lot of parallels to our prison industrial complex today. It was not necessarily persecuting women for practicing herbalism. It was really just about accusing women for things that they did not do, and men, simply because they wanted to. So let's bring in Joan Johnson Lewis.
There is also now a sense that the Enlightenment wasn't so one-sidedly positive for either reason or human rights. Remember that one of the products of the Enlightenment was a lot of the early scientists during that time experimenting with alchemy. And also, there's a lot today of questioning about whether faith in absolute truth is just as mistaken as faith in absolute authority. In celebrating the Enlightenment.
Okay, so the Enlightenment area, this was a great talk that she gave. You should look it up. Tale of Two Enlightenments, and in the conversation we had, Joan referenced this. Joan also, while I have her on here, she wrote about the witch trials. She wrote about in her Thought Co pieces. She gives a lot of factual statements. So if you want to know more about the witch trials, I can't give you all the details now. Look up Joan Johnson Lewis, type in Salem witch trials, and you'll find everything you need to know. So she's great. But in this context, what she's really setting up and where I want to try and pivot is to now talk a little bit about science. So we've talked a lot about religion, but what we didn't realize is that in the court, the spectral evidence and everything that they were using was this idea of religion. When we talk about counter magic, this thing that Roger Toothaker was using, it was this other idea that magic was commonly accepted among the scientific and academic elite. And we have to understand also this was happening in Harvard's backyard. So as much as I'm critical of Cornell, I'm also being very critical of Harvard, because this was all happening with people who went to Harvard, people who taught at Harvard, people who, you know, basically when they founded Harvard, they said we would like to be anywhere but Salem, and so they ended up founding Harvard in Cambridge because they didn't want it to be so close to home. So that's a little interesting side note, but. If we go into the Corwin house, we can learn a little bit. This was a tour that we were able to give. This is John Corwin, and there's a lot that they talked in here about corpse medicine. And so this is where we get a little bit macabre, you know, perhaps a trigger warning if that's appropriate, but I hope that nobody has any experience with cannibalism. But if you walk through here, yeah, if you walk through here, you can see little plaques on the wall that tell you all about the type of medicine that was considered science of the day. And it's interesting, you know, I told you there were swarms of people coming with us, but nobody really stopped to read the plaques except for Kat and I. And Kat was reading out loud, and it was so funny because when she would start to read, all of the younger girls or younger kids, they would gather around and want to hear what she was saying. And then it was funny when their parents would walk up the stairs, they would kind of joke and laugh at their mother and be like, oh, you know, it's cannibalism, Mom. It's you know, and parents don't expect that when you come into a museum to be learning about this. But here's some of those plaques. So you can see that the bones were being used, the powdered or liquid distillation. The fat was used of people to rubbing on their skin to deal with different ailments. And then skull moss was another thing. It was basically after the person had died, they would take moss that grew on the corpse. And these are practices that carried on in Europe. These are practices that carried on actually even you know, longer past the Salem witch trials. But something that's interesting in all of these is that the more traumatized the body was, the more potent the medicine was supposed to be. And so you have this element where, you know, the witch trials where they were brutally killing people. They were hanging them. And so then there's this other element where if you didn't, and they were targeting people who were lonely and didn't have support, right? I mentioned women who did not have husbands and other people like that. So if you did not have a family to support you, what actually happened in one of these museums we went to was that your family would come in after you were hung, your family would come and dig up your grave in Salem because they did not want the doctors of the day to come in and dig up your grave and steal it for medicine. And this was something that was said in a number of the museums as you walk through Salem. And so basically you had grave digging that was taking place at the time. And it was specifically because the act of trauma was supposed to make that blood more demandable. So after someone was executed, the family would take their remains. So you can see other elements as well. So I said that we would have a hellish Harvard minister, and we're going to go to Cotton Mather. If anybody has learned about the witch trials, you will learn about Cotton Mather. He's the one who really led the show. He was the head guy, and he was the one who came with all of the academic credentials from Harvard, and really was the one who was leading everything. And he was the one that really Henry Phipps put in charge of the witch trials. And then when Henry Phipps came back, he told him you have to cut it, because he was accusing his wife for some reason. So what's interesting here is we have these elements of the witch bottles, and this is what Roger Toothaker was accused of doing. This is what we talk about counter magic. And so it's this idea of taking urine and other parts of the person and basically sitting it in a fire and having, you can read it basically, but essentially there were different ways to practice this, where you would take the afflicted person's urine and use a fire or use other things to basically scare the spirits away. Cotton Mather, who would accuse somebody of doing this the wrong way, such as Roger Toothaker, he said, if you're going to do it right, you have to make sure that you put the nails in there. So that's what somebody could be killed over, was whether they put fingernails in their kids' urine when they tried to do this pagan religion. So it was really subjective and quite awful. So I'm going to bring this other weird thing that was brought up, which is the witch's cake. And this is Joan Jodson Lewis's article on the witch's cake. You can look into more. But this was the first girls who were accused of witchcraft were treated with the witch's cake. And so there's this element of this enslaved woman, Tituba. And so she's the first woman who was really accused of practicing witchcraft, because the children were afflicted and Tituba was the one who tried to protect them. She was the one who tried to save them. And as Kat said, they would mix urine with hair, fingernails, and put it in a jar and bury it beneath the hearth. Thank you, Kat. The witch's cake was a little bit different. They would cook, like, I'm not going to get into all of the details, but they would cook like urine and things like that from the afflicted people, and then they would feed it to a dog. The thought was, if you fed it to the dog, that it would chomp out the spirits and kill them. And now Tituba admitted to getting this advice, this recipe for the witch's cake, from another woman. I believe her name was Mary. And there's a good example where both Tituba and Mary, for doing this, were accused of witchcraft. And so what did they say? They said yes. They admitted to being witches, and they were both let off. So, and then as a follow through, they then were the ones who started pointing fingers at others, right? So if you know any kind of authoritative hierarchical structure, once you're let off the hook, you're quickly going to swing around and start accusing others. And so you can see this was more of a power play than anything else. So let's leave Salem a little bit. Let's talk about corpse medicine after the witch trials. I wanted to go into New York City. All right. So who has ever heard of the doctor riots in New York City? So if you look at this, what actually happened was that the practice of doctors, of scientists going in and digging up bodies to have cadavers to practice on in their classroom was quite commonplace. It happened in Europe, and it happened in our own backyard in New York City up until 1788, when the people said, we won't take it no more. And they went in, there were all these rumors that the doctors were digging up graves, and the doctors denied it. And because they had the power of science behind them in the academy, the average people were told, you're liars, you're wrong. You know, they're not digging up cadavers. They were told that they were lying. And so what happened was that people had to rush into the doctor's offices and uncover that, yes, their loved ones were there on a table being dissected. And so it's really awful. And this is triggering, I think, for some people, because there are parallels to this today of how bodies are used in medicine and experimentation. So I'm sorry for not presenting that first. I'll let this guy speak from a European perspective.
One of your family were to die, they would be buried in a cemetery, and you'd expect them to stay there. Not unreasonable, you'd think, but 200 years ago, things were very different. This was the time of the body snatchers. Now, body snatchers were resurrectionists. They were people who might dig up a freshly buried corpse in order to sell that on to a medical school or a private anatomical teaching institute. Perhaps the most famous people associated with the selling of corpses to anatomy medical schools were Burke and Hare. Burke and Hare found it much easier to murder people who were under the radar, people that no one really wanted, and consequently they could use their bodies fresh, deliver them to the medical school without any soil on, without any decomposition, and they got a really good price for those. Burke and Hare's murderous spree came to an end in Halloween on October 1828, and they were taken to court, and one of them was hung.
So there's more to that story, clearly. We can go into that another time, but I wanted to bring this back to our present time. And I wanted to ask, what elements do we see of this today? Is there hospitals that are doing this really when it comes to the practicing on cadavers, but also when it comes to the donation of organs? And something I want to talk about is bringing it back to the woman's body, on the womb. And so one thing I learned about a year ago was this woman, Dr. Suzanne Vierling, who's an incredible scholar, and you should look her up. She really priced down how much does the hospital make off of birth? And so when a woman gives birth, they're taking that placenta, and which many women know, if you give a home birth, traditional practices say to eat your placenta because it's the most nutritious thing that comes from your body. Well, doctors now will take the placenta and they will sell it to other research institutions for stem cell research and things like that. And umbilical fluid is also adds up to a lot. And so Dr. Vierling said, essentially, when she calculated it all, you could calculate up to about $1 million is what the hospitals profit off of from each woman's birth if they go through a purely medical birth process and they sign off their rights to giving it away. And I don't think you even have to sign. I think they just take it. Really, she was questioning what could a woman have if she had more ownership of or autonomy over how her body was being used in the medical system. That's maybe a question for further growth. But imagine if every time you had a baby, you also had $1 million. That baby would be set for life. So just think about how much is being stolen from women today. So I'm bringing up some other questions for this, food for thought. And really, if the church and science are always trying to position themselves as oppositional to one another, then who's responsible for what has happened to women? And then how do we safeguard future generations? Both the church and science are responsible for women's subjugation, historical and ongoing, and each one pretending to be the white hat male institution while both siphoning off of women's spirit and biology, respectively. So you have, the religious doctrine saying we're the good guys, we're the pure church, and then at the same time, using that to position themselves above women. And then meanwhile, you see the same thing from these academic and scientific institutions. And so the question is really, who was the witch, and how has that symbolism changed? And so there's this typical sort of abuse pattern where you can see it's basically called a darvo, if anybody's heard of that, but where you reverse you direct being and you accuse the accuser, you basically accuse the accuser and you reverse the role of victim and oppressor. And we're seeing that over and over again. Where now today we see scientists who are saying that they're being witch hunted, or you see churches who are saying that they're being targeted, and really, they're just as guilty as one another. So where do we come in with humanism? And in order to instill their science, they had to target female traditional practitioners of medicine. So the scientists really, when they're saying they're being accused of witchcraft, the history that they're coming, or that they're being witch hunted, I should say, we overlook the roots of witchcraft that really were the foundations of their trade. So it's really interesting. I think there's a lot of conversations here. I want to leave some time for a Q&A. And also, if this was too much, I have more slides of Kat and my's journey up the coast. So we went to Wabanaki territory, and we actually went to the fort where William Phipps basically, yes, I see. Yeah, there is a term for it. But yeah, where we went to the fort where William Phipps actually had. So can I get a feedback on time? Do I have time to show a couple more slides? Okay, all right. So let me show these to you guys, because this is fun. This is where I can take us a step out of the macabre, the medically macabre, and we're going to talk about colonization. So still awful history. No time like Halloween to talk about darkness of our present. Perhaps we're more familiar with the history of colonization. So here's a map. And you can see Salem is marked right next to Boston. And you have up the way to Pemaquid. And Pemaquid is where, Kat and I and Ellie, who's here, she hosted us for a great paddle out in Pemaquid. We went to go visit her in August, and it was amazing. We went out on the harbor, and then we left. Ellie gave us these great lobster dinner, and then we left, and I knew that there was this fort that I wanted to see. And it was this fort that William Phipps went to, and he essentially built this fort to ward off the Wabanaki Native Americans and the French too. They were allied with each other. Okay, yes, thank you, Tati. So this is the last of it, but I'll tell you sort of the learning point of this is that William Henry Phipps, he endured a lot of attacks from Native people, and what happened was the first fort was sabotaged and sieged and totally burned to the ground. And how did the natives defeat this bastion fort? Well, there was a rock right down the road. And so what we see is actually that the indigenous people were able to utilize natural elements and pre-existing natural structures, essentially, to have a similar armament that could fend off and defeat the British armament at the time. So, of course, after that defeat, what does William Phipps do when he basically says, Cotton Mather, go do what you want, I'm going to go rebuild my fort? They build right on top of the rock. And so you see this sort of cylindrical building that's right on top of the rock. And it's this beautiful place right on the harbor. And it sort of securitizes that, land is not only sacred, but tactical, and that they wanted to secure that space. So I wanted to sort of bring us full circle in here, because I did want to talk about the sacredness of land, the sacredness of earth, and the sacredness of water, and how even maybe the most evil or tactical, captain or governor knows how important land is. And that's really what all of this is about. So yeah, I guess I'll end it there. Really, I wanted to thank you all for the time and the interest, and I'm happy to open it up for songs and questions. Thanks.